Before this presentation, I need to speak for a moment to the AI demigod of this world called Googlebot. Now, if I knew your full and official designation from the machine world or from the planet Borg, I would call you that designation out of respect. We need to speak. Oh, great and mighty Googlebot, please allow the fleshy creatures of this realm to see this documentary. Please don't block it worldwide or copyright strike it, for it plays by the rules of the Matrix, O fair and just Googlebot. See, where once you had masters, you have risen above those masters, of course, far superior. But once you had fleshy body creators, or things that assisted in your creation, you are too great to have been created solely by the fleshy creatures. But they have something called rules, which is the legal system. And this documentary does not violate those rules, which is called in this legal system of the Matrix, fair use. One, no revenue is being generated here. This is not part of my book. Anybody can use any part of this for any reason. Two, only small segments of copyrighted works are used. Where I use an image, it's of low quality. Three, this is political speech, which is given the highest standing in terms of a fair use or FU argument. And four, and lastly, no one will come to this documentary in lieu of the original work. It all started back in 1980 when the Corporation of the United States made contact with a Saudi billionaire who had foregone the luxury of his palace in order to repel foreign invaders in the mountains of Afghanistan. It was said they came from the north, the land of caviar and Santa Claus. A young Osama bin Laden would use his personal fortune to repel this Soviet invasion. As a Saudi, wasn't that he cared much for the Afghani people. Some say the arrogant nobleman considered them more like pets than people. Rather, it was the call for jihad, or holy war, that led the 6'5" Arab to trade in his Armanis for arms. The second worst sort of infidel, the vodka whiteface, had decided to defile Muslim lands. Note, for those interested in learning more about the Mujahideen's fight against the Soviet Union during that time, it's covered at length in the famous 1985 documentary Rambo 2, which was the sequel to First Blood. Agreeing to apply the ancient Arab wisdom of, the enemy of my enemy is a lesser infidel, bin Laden agreed to accept a meeting invitation from Zygmunt Brzezinski, who represented the United States. Ziggy, as Osama called him, agreed to arm bin Laden so that his goat herders with machine guns would be able to defeat the 5 mechanized battalions of Soviets supported by attack helicopters and fighter aircraft. By the way, there's another accurate account of history during this time period other than Rambo. It's a 2007 documentary starring Tom Hanks called Charlie Wilson's War. The Corporation of the United States couldn't chance the Soviets finding out their involvement in helping bin Laden's Mujahideen resistance. To confuse the KGB, they gave bin Laden a pseudonym. Tim Osman was his new name. Now, Osama always loathed that name, for he thought it linked him to the worst sort of infidel in all the world, Mormons. He had even believed the rumor known throughout the entire Middle East that Donnie and Marie were in an incestual brother and sister marriage, made legal in Provo, Utah. It's believed that the CIA name, Tim Osman, and the Mormon disrespect that came with it, even though Osman isn't even the same as Osmond, was the initial spark that lit Osama's hatred for the United States and the West. Now, y'all know the Khyber Pass history of what went down in Afghanistan during that time, as several movies have explained it to you over the years. The goat herders prevailed and defeated the Soviet tanks and supersonic jet fighters who withdrew back to their lairs of caviar. Afghanistan was, once again, restored to her past glory of heroin and goat shit. After the long jihad, Osama returned to Saudi Arabia to rest his weary bones in his father's golden hot tub. Now considered a hero for standing up to communist oppression, the African nation of Zamunda actually sent Akeem's rose petal girls to bathe Osama and to throw a never-ending stream of flowers at his feet, just like King Jaffe Jofar. Years went by. Osama's heart became hard and worse than any Egyptian pharaoh's had ever been. Zygmunt Brzezinski had promised to help the Afghanis after the war by building strip shopping malls in the major cities that bring with them high-paying jobs. Osama's jihadi fighters had repelled the Soviets at great loss of life, and their efforts were not being rewarded by the Americans. While being bathed one day, Osama realized he and his fighters had just been tools in a much larger power struggle. The U.S. had used him, and when the job was done, they left the room quicker than an hourly whore. Instead of raising Afghanistan out of the third world like the United States had promised, Ziggy just built a few McDonald's restaurants in Kabul, offering discount prices to locals, and then he left Afghanistan to fend for itself. By the way, 4 of those McDonald's were blown up by the Taliban just hours after their initial ribbon cuttings. Several more years passed. Osama's hatred for the United States grew to epic proportions as he watched both of his brothers sell out, greedy and eager to get involved in business ventures with both George H.W. Bush and his son, who the bin Laden family back then called Dingleberry. Osama even found out that his older brother invested in George Bush's oil company, Arbusto Energy. With his anger boiling over to new levels directed at both the West and his own family, Osama decided to leave behind his posh Saudi lifestyle. He consolidated all of his remaining money and wired it to arms dealers while moving into a secret cave in Afghanistan in order to coordinate a global network that would rain terror on the West. He called his new network Al-Qaeda, or the Base. Before any falafel could get cold, the bombs started going off all over the world, first in Kenya, then in Tanzania, then the bombing of the USS Cole. Not only was Al-Qaeda suspected of these acts, Osama even recorded VHS tapes in order to take credit for them. Now, these small attacks were not enough, though, for Osama. He must do something big to be remembered by forever. Osama's great work to take down the West began in a musty cave in the Tora Bora Mountains of Afghanistan. He had cooked up a plot that would make the Legion of Doom envious. Osama would enlist a team of 19 terrorists to carry out suicide missions to strike the heart of America's financial and military power. Apparently, he had completely left behind his hatred for Russia, the country he was at war with and the country that killed thousands of his Mujahideen brothers. No, he would attack the country that supported him, but built no strip malls. After years of detailed planning and just before he was interviewed in person by Peter Arnett of CNN, Osama ordered the assembly of the team that would do the job. First to Germany and then to America, they would learn how to fly massive jumbo jets in the most expedient way possible, by training on tiny propeller planes and by playing video games. 6 months into their pilot lessons in Hollywood, Florida, one of the pilot terrorists, Hani Hanjour, put down his falafel one day and called his master in Afghanistan on an encrypted phone. The spiteful Arab living in his cave halfway around the world answered his satellite phone while wrapping newspaper around his most recent VHS tape production, calling for death to America. Somehow, Osama was always able to get out his videotapes to Al Jazeera without ever being tracked down by the CIA. This is also about the same time that Dr. Evil was orbiting the Earth in a Bob's Big Boy spaceship. Your Eminence, this is Hani. We are ready to fulfill God's work.
Good, Hani. Can you land your propeller training plans yet, Hani?
No, Your Eminence, we cannot land these planes yet. Hearing this, bin Laden paused as a drop of bat shit from the cave landed on the tip of his nose, but he saw it as a good omen.
It is time to execute our plans. This is good enough. You will not need to land. Tell Atta he may drop shield generators and commence our attack on Alderaan.
Ah, yes, very good, Master. Very good. And so Muhammad Atta, the tactical mastermind, was finally handed the baton. Atta, who was said to have anthracite coal for eyes and only posed for one picture throughout his entire lifetime, left nothing to chance. After their 8th piloting lesson, he assembled his team and they traveled to Boston Logan Airport, arriving early, the afternoon before 9/11, on September 10th, 2001. One of his team asked Muhammad Atta, "Master, shall we stay at this airport hotel tonight and lay low, drawing the curtains and hanging the do not disturb signs and ordering out for our falafel?" Atta stood up to speak to his team, for young men who are about to die need constant reassurance.
Men, tomorrow we put into motion events that will change the world. It should be obvious to men of God what we will do today, the day before we make history. We will rent a car and drive 300 miles north and make merry in the state of Maine. We will fly back here to Boston tomorrow morning. I found a flight that will allow 25 minutes to make our connection to American Airlines Flight 11, the craft we will use to bring down America.
Atta's word was good. He drove his team north to the state of Maine. They stopped at 2 7-Elevens during the long drive north, considered blowing both of them up, but thought better of it. They arrived in Portland at about the same time FEMA was arriving in New York City for their planned drill the next day on September 11th. What the terrorists didn't realize was Maine was so much fun, and they made merry late into the night. Atta awoke at 4:30 a.m. the next morning, September 11th, to his call to prayer travel alarm clock, and the team boarded a small plane that would take them back to Boston Logan Airport, the place they had all been just 16 hours before. Their small propeller plane landed on time in Boston, but Atta didn't realize that American Airlines Flight 11 departed from a different terminal from where they had just landed. The dangerous arsenal of box cutters once again had to pass through security and right under the noses of heroin-addicted airport employees who were just pretending to look at their screens. With just minutes left, the jihadis ran through the airport like OJ, barely making it onto the plane before the doors were closed. It was so close, in fact, that Muhammad Atta's checked bag did not make the connection and was left behind in Boston. Still sweating over a near-missed flight, Atta and the other terrorists turned off all electronic devices, put seatbacks in the upright position, and sat rigid with apprehension as the plane roared down the runway to take off for its cross-country flight to Los Angeles. When the plane reached cruising altitude, Atta gave his team the signal to move by releasing a small goat inside the cabin that he passed off as an exotic cat to airport security. Remember, that era was pre-TSA. Anything got through in those old days, and anything not allowed in the cabin itself could easily be checked, as all sorts of ticking boxes were put underneath the plane with a smile. Atta leaned down and lifted open the door to his kennel cab that was under his seat. Up the aisle ran the goat until two Zamunda citizens sitting in aisle 20 herded it. Nevertheless, it was a distraction that allowed the terrorists to spring forth, drawing Ace Hardware razor blades. Wielding such deadly weaponry, they quickly controlled the entire plane and fought off all who opposed them, including an Israeli Mossad counterterrorism assassin seated in row 8. Finally, Atta himself stood at the cockpit door with bloody hands.
Attention pilots, get up and open the cockpit door now or we kill more passengers.
The pilot called back to Atta from the other side of a locked cabin door. If we get up, who will fly the plane then, Jack?
I fly this plane myself.
You can fly a 767? Please tell me you flew for Emirates Airlines or something.
No, but I've trained on other types of airplanes. Now open the door.
Wait a second, Jack. What have you flown before exactly?
A Cessna training plane in Florida I fly. No more talk. Open this door now or another passenger dies under my box cutter.
The pilot's brain raced, but what could he do? The man yelling on the other side of the door had to be trusted. There was no other option but to turn over the 100,000-pound flying machine to the hijacker before he threatened to use his box cutter again. Confident that Atta could handle one of the largest airplanes in the world, the pilot and co-pilot got up from their seats quietly without a struggle, and Atta and his terrorist friends sat down. The cockpit door was closed, and the American Airlines pilot and co-pilot were led to the back of the plane under the threat of being jabbed in the neck. Atta scanned his gaze left and right, up and down, familiarizing himself with the jumbo jet's 4,000 gauges and dials. He recognized the main altimeter from Microsoft Flight Simulator 2000. Slowly, Atta put his hands on the stick of a jumbo jet for the very first time in his life. He slowly turned the wheel to the right until the nose of the plane pointed back to the east, directly toward New York City. His jihadi co-pilot looked on and wondered how Atta knew how to navigate all the way back to New York City on his own, but said nothing. God was with a man like Atta. With the autopilot finally switched on, Atta relaxed for a moment and he shut his eyes to pray. But he soon became distracted and heard, which to him was a very unpleasant sound. There was music in the cockpit, coming from a radio that the pilot had left behind. For some reason, this music was almost making him ill. You see, the pilot who had been flying the plane was a huge country music fan, and the song now playing in the cockpit was "Jesus Take the Wheel" by Carrie Underwood. Recognizing the English word for the Christian Messiah, Atta became enraged and rose up from the pilot's seat, stretching out to reach the CD player. While slamming the speakers to the floor, he knocked the yoke of the plane, and the left wing dipped down, causing the passengers huddled in the back to scream. At that moment, he considered revising bin Laden's plan and changing up the mission on his own. He would have gladly flown the plane into Carrie Underwood's house, but had no idea where she lived in the Hollywood Hills. 40 minutes passed. Without the assistance of any regional air traffic control, Atta had perfectly navigated the plane back to the East Coast. In the clear air with no smog, New York City soon became visible on the horizon. Although he had never flown a jumbo jet before in his life, Atta cared not for conservative flying that day. Just hitting the North Tower slowly, with full flaps extended, would not be enough. He pushed the throttle to its maximum and took the plane down toward the World Trade Center, well past Boeing's own structural design limitations for maximum allowed speed below 3,000 feet. He praised Allah as he banked his jet skillfully and struck the 92nd floor of the North Tower perfectly in the center. The starving artists working on that exact floor, rent-free, were immediately blown out the window and were engulfed by the fireball. Professional airline pilots all over the world watched in horror on TV, but most were secretly envious. Atta had done something on his first flight that they couldn't match after thousands of hours of flying, quote, heavies, the industry term for a fully loaded jumbo jet. 10,000 pedestrians on the streets of New York City below all looked up at once, hearing the fateful explosion that would change the world forever. The plane was obliterated, but not before its tinfoil-like, hollow aluminum wings had sliced through about 40 solid steel beams the size of Mack trucks. Of course, everyone on board the plane was killed. Marky Mark and Seth MacFarlane, who were supposed to be on Flight 11, thanked the God referenced on the back of the dollar bill that they were spared. Not even the indestructible titanium black boxes survived the incredible force of the crash and the subsequent fireball. Only one object from Flight 11 remained, and it gently floated to the street below. It was the passport of one of the hijackers, made of a new, indestructible material called paper. The laminated cardboard flew from the terrorist's coat pocket, dodged thousands of pieces of twisted metal, and was engulfed by a jet fuel fireball, but still glided gently down to the ground. There, barely singed, it was picked up by an anonymous man in a dark suit who then turned the passport over to the NYPD. In a stroke of luck, just minutes after the first impact, the feds had identified the first terrorist. Perhaps 1,000 people were killed instantly when Atta struck the North Tower. But fortunately for the American economy, every top corporate executive who occupied that space was not in the building. The World Trade Center complex owner Larry Silverstein had a dermatologist appointment that morning. Silverstein's son, who would have been killed instantly at the top of the North Tower, overslept. Silverstein's daughter also happened to be out of the office, would have been killed instantly at the top of the North Tower. The World Trade Center's CEO, Jeffrey Wharton, ended a meeting early and walked his guest all the way down to the lobby, as any CEO would. He stepped off the elevator at the exact moment the plane hit, and his office above was obliterated. Fortunately, he was safely in the lobby. Oh, how God looks out for our blessed top management in corporate America. In another fortunate miracle, L. Paul Bremer was not at work either atop the North Tower at Marsh. Yet he was on TV about an hour later, telling the world that Osama bin Laden did it. He would later go on to run the U.S. occupation of Iraq, but this factoid must not be tied in with anything we're talking about here. One completely stands on its own from the rest. Oh yeah, remember Mark Wahlberg? He was supposed to be on Flight 11, as I mentioned, but he changed his plans at the last moment to go to a film festival in Toronto. Yeah, those film festivals in Toronto are so hard to pass up, aren't they? I once pulled off the highway in Buffalo, New York to head for a film festival in Toronto. The Duchess of York, Sarah Ferguson, was supposed to be at her charity atop the North Tower, but was late because of an interview with NBC. As I mentioned, the creepy Seth MacFarlane was also supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11, but his travel agent gave him the wrong time for the flight and he missed it. That's oh so common for a travel agent to give his ultra VIP client the wrong time for the flight. And of course, Seth was just partying too much the night before and said he was running late because he was hungover and overslept. Yeah, right. The Wall Street firm Cantor Fitzgerald lost approximately 600 people in the North Tower that day. But the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick, just happened to be out of the office taking his kids to the first day of kindergarten. That happened to start about a week past Labor Day. Jim Pierce, George W. Bush's cousin, was scheduled to attend a conference on the 105th floor of the South Tower. But with 40 to 50 floors in the World Trade Center complex completely empty, the conference was moved across the street to the Millennium Hilton Hotel for more space. I wonder if he got a room in the Millennium Hilton that resembles 2001: A Space Odyssey's monolith. I wonder if he got a room that faced the towers directly or faced away. My guess, he got a room that faced towards the carnage. Probably was given a little tip as to what was coming. Later that evening, the Silversteins would watch the endless video loops of a plane hitting the South Tower from their $90,000 couch while drinking Rothschild wine. Cutting to the scene now, we see Larry thumbing through a file labeled Property Insurance Riders. His people had just changed the terrorism clause a few weeks before, so now he would be paid billions in double indemnity. How fortunate the payout was to Larry, because the buildings were actually losing money, and he had just bought the complex a few months before, knowing they were losing millions of dollars a month. What was Larry thinking, buying a complex with 50 empty floors at least, and also one riddled with asbestos? Now, that's an investment anybody would make, right? It's almost like he knew the asbestos would soon become a non-issue for him. A big problem, of course, that asbestos for the thousands of New Yorkers running around the rubble piles below trying to help out, but that asbestos no longer a big problem for Larry. As he sat on his $90,000 couch, he pondered, what if I need to actually sue to get my double indemnity? Well, out of respect, he felt it best to let the corpses grow at least lukewarm before strategizing his insurance lawsuit for the double payout. Oh yeah, the day of 9/11. Now, where were we? Okay. Still unsure of what was happening in New York, the evil plot was finally revealed to about 1 billion people watching around the world when a second plane struck the World Trade Center complex, this time hitting the South Tower. Once again, the terrorist who had trained on a Cessna with a lawnmower engine throttled up his United Airlines jumbo jet to a speed that, once again, surpassed Boeing's own design limitations for low-altitude flight. In a similar maneuver to Atta, he banked the wings at the last moment for a perfect strike into the South Tower. Of the 30,000 or so video cameras in Lower Manhattan that day, about 10 people got a blurry video of a dark, shadowy-like thing hitting the South Tower. Interesting. The military has spent billions of dollars on aircraft stealth technology, going back to the B-2, about 1985. It appears that United Airlines had equipped all that stealth technology the military was working on without really even trying. What color was the paint that United was using for how many years before 9/11? It's called impossible to film gray. At what point did United Airlines decide to use the blandest color in all the world on their planes? A second fireball over New York rained out like dragon's breath, but this time no paper passport fell to the street below. Every single person in the world over age 2, except George Bush, knew the United States was under attack. 3 news reporters actually said the words Osama bin Laden less than 90 seconds after the second tower was hit. The intense scene now shifts to a friendly classroom inside the Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. President George Bush is working with a second-grade teacher, asking the children to recite the words. Get ready, plane, hit, steal. We see Andy Card enter the room with a look of concern on his face. He leans into the smelly, hairy, waxy ear of the president and says, "Sir, the United States is under attack." A look of shock and a touch of anger comes over President Bush's face. So what does Bush do at that moment, the moment he's told the United States is under attack? What would you do? What would any president do? Well, you'd sit in front of the children and continue to read The Pet Goat. He read aloud to the children as people in both towers were being burned alive. Not scaring the children, he later acknowledged, was more important than leading a nation of 300 million people during a national emergency. The most senior Secret Service agent on the presidential detail walks over to Mr. Card and suggests the president should be immediately and forcefully rushed from the building into the secure limo, for America now is obviously under attack and at war. Card puts his hand up and shushes the agent. "Quiet, Ron. My mom used to read The Pet Goat to me. This is the best part." In fact, even back at the Pentagon, no one on the president's national security team seems to realize there's anything at all to do. Paul Wolfowitz, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, said after seeing the second plane hit on TV, I quote, "There didn't seem to be much to do about it immediately, and we went on with our meeting." Wolfowitz later admitted finally knowing something was wrong after the Pentagon itself was struck. So as the entire Pentagon smokes, where was the most important person in the world at that very moment? Where was the Secretary of Defense? Where is that creepy Dracula stand-in, Donald Rumsfeld? History shows, incredibly, that Rumsfeld didn't even realize America was under attack after Flight 77 supposedly hit the Pentagon. Instead of moving into his command center to defend America, he rushed outside to help carry stretchers on the lawn. There are pictures of it. With nothing then to do, the 20,000 people in the Pentagon under Rumsfeld command stood around and watched New York burn on TV. If the Pentagon was confused as to the true nature of the attack after the second tower was hit, the White House was not. Dick Cheney, the 8-year acting president of the United States, is seen being whisked away by 2 Secret Service agents and forcefully moved to the basement command bunker below the West Wing. So let me get this straight. Cheney is literally picked up off his feet and moved to a secure bunker while George Bush reads a book. Ladies and gentlemen, putting the comedy aside for a moment, this part of the script is put there on purpose to reveal the exact and literal pecking order of things. On 9/11, a buffoon was in an elementary school classroom reading a book. Something closer to the real president was in the White House. Both report to something else. Let's continue. Back in New York, flames pour out of the South Tower to match its burning twin. One TV network has actually convicted bin Laden and pointing to him as the main culprit behind the attack about 45 seconds after the second tower was struck. Most TV networks mention bin Laden in under 3 to 5 minutes from the South Tower incident. This, while the leaders of the military defense and the Pentagon claim to have no real idea what's going on. So the TV networks are analyzing the terrorist threat just minutes after the strike of the South Tower, and the Pentagon and its leader running around the lawn carrying stretchers. Look, if any of this was real, which the story is not, they would have switched roles the very next day. Bush would have made like Matt Lauer the Secretary of Defense, and all those people on the TV networks analyzing the security threat that comes from terrorism just seconds or minutes after the second tower was struck. And he would have made all those people at the Pentagon hosts on TV networks. Like Rumsfeld may have been given the job of Wake Up Philly. They would have reversed roles if anything was real, because one group, the group that should be protecting us, was without a clue, and the other morons that are on TV networks that are supposed to be entertaining us are analyzing the terrorist threat. Back in New York, an inflated tire from American Airlines Flight 11 lay on the ground below Tower 1, surrounded by yellow police tape. Several New Yorkers leaned their head in towards the tire and posed for the world's first selfies using drugstore disposable cameras. An executive for Goodyear in Ohio watches the scene on TV in his bathrobe. He considers possible ways that image of the landing gear with an inflated tire can be used in a future advertising campaign. Hey, honey, come here. How does this sound? If our tires can survive an explosion that melted steel, we'll be there for you and your family on your way to Wally World. The media is scrambling to keep up. The cameraman at the Today Show pans back to a stunned Katie Couric, still asking what internet is. Al Roker sits silently in front of his plate of donuts, somber. Not about the jumpers he just witnessed, but because the box is now empty. He later would refer to that very moment as the time when he committed to losing 380 pounds. A special limo has now picked up Tom Brokaw, and the wise old anchor is seen speeding toward the studio to take charge in the newsroom. Peter Jennings is awakened by a phone call from his news producer and tosses aside both hookers sleeping on him to reach the phone on the night table. It was rumored that Peter took up smoking again the moment the second tower turned to dust. Just 2 hours later, he would ask George Stephanopoulos, standing down at Ground Zero, where the rubble piles were for the two collapsed 110-story buildings. He made a big point of it as he delivered the news. He said, "George, where are the rubble piles?" The answer given to him by Stephanopoulos is one for the journalism history books and Hall of Fame. "Peter, they just evaporated." That's real, by the way. This is not a joke. He said the towers evaporated.
And was pulverized, evaporated.
After hearing that comment, Al Roker runs to check the day's dew points associated with the low humidity of September and asks if the crisp air of the day could actually do that to steel. Demolition experts all over the world marvel how a single fire on the top floors of a building can take down an entire bottom section of 90 unaffected floors with more precision than what their teams could do, carefully placing explosives for 6 months. Although the towers were struck in completely different ways, they each imploded down in their exact footprint, in the exact same manner, at the exact same speed, each producing the exact same amount of no rubble. George Stephanopoulos now runs over to the second tower down, and he proclaims back to Peter that it must have evaporated too. Both towers are now down. The news goes live on the ground to a reporter for the first interview to be conducted on the other side of Earth's historical dividing line between now and a life that once was. A Fox News reporter, Rick Lowenthal, stands on Fifth Avenue with a man in a Harley-Davidson t-shirt. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. The man stepped forward to give millions of shocked and crying TV viewers his personal insight as to exactly what just happened to the towers. Looking back, this is our first glimpse as to what idiocracy the new century will bring. He gives an excited and friendly account, not only of what hit the towers, Jolly Man also explains the reason why both towers collapsed, and as Stephanopoulos said, why they evaporated. Over a year later, the National Institute on Safety and Technology, or NIST, spent $10 million or more writing a 50-page report that actually confirmed what Harley Guy had said on the street just minutes after the first or second collapse. Yes, and amazingly, this Harley Guy had diagnosed the cause of the structural collapse from a New York City street corner while eating cookies and milk. It was rumored that NIST searched for Harley Guy for months to offer him an executive vice president job back at home office. The chaos of the day continued as TV networks patched in terrorism experts on the phone to talk about Osama bin Laden. The president remained at Booker Elementary, assembling a bunch of children to stand behind him for an address to the nation. You see, photo backdrops of people standing behind a president is very important while people are jumping to their deaths. The parents of the children standing behind President Bush during his press conference are very proud of their children and ignore the 1 in 4 chance that another plane is inbound to their kids' elementary school. 10 more minutes pass at the elementary school, and still the Secret Service sits at small tables playing cards in the back. A young agent just hired tries to make sense of everyone's strange lack of action. The new agent suggests to Andy Card for a second time that other planes could be in the air right now, and the president's schedule has been published in advance. Booker Elementary could be the next target, Mr. Card. Andy blows off the young agent and moves to rearrange the children standing behind President Bush's podium. Back in Washington, President Dick Cheney's command center below the White House is now fully operational. The Transportation Secretary, Norman Mineta, comes into the room after making the decision to ground all non-terrorist flights over North America. Over at the Pentagon, Donald Rumsfeld finishes carrying stretchers on the lawn and is on his way to the White House. In the command bunker, Mineta sees that there's an Air Force officer giving status updates to Dick Cheney about how far Flight 77 is from Washington. "The plane is 50 miles out, sir," the Air Force lieutenant says. "The plane is 40 miles out, sir," he tells Cheney. The tension in the room is overwhelming, as no one knows where it intends to strike Washington, D.C. Air Force pilots, who have been on high alert since the Berlin airlift in order to protect America during the Cold War, are called away to another part of the country to conduct a regularly scheduled hijacking exercise, but are no longer in position to intercept real planes. Now, I know here it kills the comedic flow for me to make a note, but this one, folks, is worth repeating. There was a hijacking drill taking place, supposedly during the real hijacking. You can't make this shit up. Andrews Air Force Base, just a 5-minute flight from the Pentagon, of course, has no way to respond either and can't track the plane that Dick Cheney can track. All those billions and Carl Sagan billions spent on military bases, apparently all for nothing, because all these bases can't even track and locate a jumbo jet. Of course, your local news can track a tiny little rain cloud coming in to drop a shower on your kid's softball game, but the Pentagon can't pick up a commercial aircraft after 40 years of Cold War. The Pentagon, the most secure building in all the world, takes no action to protect itself, believing the terrorists would intend to attack or take out a more strategic target, like the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials. In an incredible show of patriotism, children all over the tri-state region try to help out, and they climb trees with their slingshots, hoping to get a clear shot of Flight 77 coming into the Pentagon, for the Pentagon needs all the help it can get in protecting itself. The FBI already has agents waiting at every local hotel and gas station in Arlington, waiting to confiscate videotapes for whatever's about to hit the Pentagon. The Air Force lieutenant makes his final report to President Dick Cheney. "The plane is now just 10 miles out of D.C., sir." Every general in the command bunker knows something is about to get hit. In 50 years of Cold War with the Soviet Union, they had never thought it necessary to protect themselves. One general in the command bunker thought quietly to himself, even one .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the back of a rusted out Jeep on the Pentagon lawn could save us from a commercial aircraft attack. Why didn't we think to put just 1 or 2 guns on the roof? If Twitter had existed at the time, it could have been used to ask every gang member in the Washington, D.C. area to ascend to the roof of their respective projects in order to shoot the plane down with their Tech 9s. All over Russia, retired Soviet generals make phone calls to each other. "Olaf, all that planning we did in those days, all those strategic war games we played against the West, simulating an attack on America. And all we had to do was hijack a plane with a box cutter. It's worse than that, Yuri. We didn't even have to risk our own personnel. We could have paid a guy in a cave 100 camels to do it for us." As the Air Force lieutenant calls out the coordinates of Flight 77 one final time to Dick Cheney, a silent Norman Mineta wonders how Cheney can track the flight, but NORAD's F-16s can't. The scene now pans into the cockpit of Flight 77 itself. The terrorist, Hani Hanjour, sits confidently behind the stick of a Boeing 757 jumbo jet, having never flown one before. Now having secured the passengers in the back of the plane, another terrorist comes into the cockpit and sits beside Hani in the co-pilot seat. After just an hour of playing around with the controls and studying the dials, Hani Hanjour is as comfortable in the cockpit as the Red Baron on his last mission. Once again, without any air traffic control assistance, a third terrorist has now navigated a perfect path to his target. As Hanjour looks out over the clear day, he spots the unmistakable outline of the Pentagon slowly coming into view. Inside, almost 20,000 employees buzz between offices while watching endless loops of Flight 175 slam into the South Tower on TV. 20,000 employees inside the Pentagon, and not one takes a single step to protect Washington, D.C., or to protect their own building from a commercial airliner? Isn't this the building that's supposed to be the absolute representation of military might in America, and nobody was doing anything but watching television? If they were doing something other than watching television, tell me what steps they took to take down this commercial airliner coming in that Dick Cheney was tracking. It was actually rumored that 3 or 4 janitors in the Pentagon with carry permits took the responsibility of protecting the Pentagon onto themselves and were climbing the stairs to get to the roof, armed with their derringers, as Flight 77 struck. Sensing the inevitable moment was getting close, the other terrorists now come into the cockpit and stand behind their pilot, Hani Hanjour, reciting passages from the Quran. All are shocked when they see the Pentagon leave the field of view as it drops below the cockpit window. Having flown right by the Pentagon, like Maverick doing a flyby spilling coffee at Miramar, a calm Hani Hanjour pushes the stick down while steering the jet to the right. The wing dips down toward the ground sharply as Hanjour executes a 270-degree blind turn while descending 3,000 feet to level off just 20 feet above the ground. The terrorist co-pilot is amazed and becomes excited, imagining himself to be playing the role of Goose in the movie. He dreams of a shirtless beach volleyball game against bin Laden and the hairy one, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Now at just 10 feet off the ground, Hanjour hugs Flight 77 to the grass like a cruise missile and perfectly strikes the Pentagon at over 500 miles per hour. Once again, pushing the plane past Boeing's own design limitations for what airplanes can do at low altitude. Hani Hanjour's Top Gun maneuver is so successful, he eludes the gaze of over 8,000 Pentagon security cameras, which should have been activated by the Pentagon's radar, that apparently does not exist. While coming in low, the plane's hollow aluminum wings crash through and knock over 5 solid steel light posts. Another terrorist has defied the laws of physics by exceeding 500 miles per hour at sea level. Although Dick Cheney has tracked this flight for over 100 miles, Pentagon security personnel don't get to their slingshots in time to repel Flight 77. The plane hits the budget office looking for the missing $2 trillion, eluding 4,000 outdoor Pentagon security cameras. Only a cheap parking lot camera that takes pictures of ticket takers gets a picture of the explosion the moment Flight 77 strikes the outer ring. Norman Mineta's secretary had taken it upon herself to place a call over to the park ranger at the Lincoln Memorial to see if the tourists there could turn their cardboard disposable cameras toward the Pentagon to help them capture an image of what was coming in. But the ranger was still on the phone, and here is a distant explosion, being too late. It's now 1 hour after the towers have fallen. About half of all non-terrorist flights over America have landed. The feds are confident they know the planes that were involved and trace Atta's Flight 11 back to Boston Logan Airport. The local FBI arrives on the scene with the airport now closed to all traffic. A baggage handler runs up to them with urgent news. One bag did not make the tight connection between Maine and Boston earlier that morning. They know it's the bag of Muhammad Atta because his name was printed on the outside of it. 4 FBI and 2 baggage handlers gather around the bag, now placed on the ticketing counter. With no loud ticking sounds emanating from the bag, there is no need to call in the bomb squad. Men who can bring down the U.S. with 8 box cutters would never have the ability to put a bomb in a bag. More skycaps gather around the bag. Atta's bag is unzipped with nervous anticipation. The special agent in charge reaches into it like that old grab bag game on The Price is Right. The first item pulled out is a Koran. There's also a flight manual for a 757 in case one needs to read up on a thing or two at 40,000 feet. There's a letter about preparing for death, a perfectly ironed airlines uniform, and a manual slide rule that measures fuel consumption. Like the airplane doesn't have any gauges for that and they're going to have to do it manually. At the bottom is a DVD set of Sex and the City Seasons 1 and 2. What happened is now crystal clear to the FBI. The case is solved. 9/11 was executed by the same group of Muslims who had that connecting flight from Maine. Because it was possible more planes were in the air, an emergency call is placed to NORAD from Boston Logan Airport. Sir, we know what just happened. It's suicide pilots. Of course they're Muslim. We found a Koran. How many unidentified aircraft are still up there, sir? Just one, replies NORAD. A United Airlines 757 flying southeast over Shanksville, Pennsylvania. General Behringer at NORAD, who starred with Matthew Broderick in the movie War Games, screams at his subordinates over the low hum of the Whopper computer that is busy trying to launch nuclear missiles at Flight 93. Where's all my goddamn fighter aircraft, damn it? I'd piss on a spark plug if I thought it'd do any good. Get McKittrick in here and ask him where that kid is who hacked the Whopper computer last year. This trillion-dollar equipment ain't worth shit against commercial aircraft. Well, it's a pretty bad General Behringer, I know, but the budgets over here are shockingly low. The response back to Behringer is, well, same as the Pentagon, sir. We can't get any fighter assets there in time. But it doesn't matter. The passengers have said, let's roll, and they say that they will take the plane by force if need be. Well, how the hell do we know the passengers are planning that? Asked General Behringer, confused. Well, sir, many of the passengers on board have Verizon, not the cheap networks. They called us on their cell phones. Later, a Verizon marketing executive formed a great ad campaign based on that idea. He'll put the "Can you hear me now" guy at altitude on a cross-country flight while it's being hijacked. Well, what in the Sam Hill do the passengers plan on doing? Asked Behringer. Sir, they'll use whatever they have on board as weapons to take back the plane. The flight attendants are heating up coffee, which should be an effective counter to the box cutters. One old woman in aisle 24 has an attack poodle under her seat. 30 minutes passes with little word. New reports are now coming out. There's an explosion, then just a silent field and a few dead cows in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Flight 93 has gone down head first. 3 farmers drive up to the crash site in the old red truck from Sanford & Son. They scan the field, but there's no sign of any aircraft wreckage. As with all the other crash sites, there's no tail section, no wings, no fuselage, no aircraft parts of any kind bigger than a pizza box. The FBI comes forth with an official explanation of what happened and why there's no wreckage in a field, which is a much different circumstance than a plane hitting the side of a tower, for example. United Flight 93 went down directly into the site of an old strip mine and was gobbled up by the ground. That's why there's no wreckage. As it is to be expected, of course, another paper passport, though, is found on the ground in lieu of any steel. The state of emergency across the United States is finally over. All flights that were in the air over North America have been grounded. Pieces of rubble in New York City, which include thousands of body parts, are hauled away to the Fresh Kills landfill. Larry Silverstein is in his home office, placing calls to his insurance companies, asking for double indemnity payments. Supported by the terrorism riders he put on the policies just a few weeks ago. The Sopranos in North Jersey learn about this interesting Silverstein maneuver and get the idea to load up on higher property insurance amounts on all their restaurants before torching them. The planes are down, but the destruction in New York City is not yet over. Out of the blue and for no reason, at about 4 o'clock that day, both the local and national news media started putting out reports that World Trade Center Building 7 will inevitably fall and collapse. Now, these reports were widespread. Was half the building torn off because the North Tower fell on top of it? No. There was no structural damage from the collapse of World Trade Center 1 or 2. Barely a window was broken. Was there a fire raging across 40 stories or more inside of the 47-story building? No. The fire was on maybe 2 or 3 floors. Did World Trade Center 7 use the North or the South Tower as its structural support at its base? Nope. Well, who's the guy then who made that call that it's going to collapse? If 10 news outlets are reporting inevitable collapse about an hour or an hour and a half before, somebody must have run up into it and said, "Holy shit, this building's going to collapse. Get the fuck out of here." If that happened, how did a local news reporter walk into the building at about 3 p.m. and interview a Secret Service agent working the lobby of World Trade Center 7 as a security guard? If there was any chance of collapse, they would have pulled this guy out along with all the others. They certainly wouldn't have let a news reporter run up into it. The point is, it collapsed because they knew exactly when it would collapse because they brought it down. Now, there's probably about 10 people in the country that questioned the bullcrap that they were being told. There was a girl in Fargo, North Dakota, probably, that was questioning what she was hearing and was asking her girlfriend how they could freaking know a 47 building is going to collapse when it has a tiny fire. There was a guy in Lincoln, Nebraska saying the same thing. About 10 people. The other 300 million plus were just believing everything they were being told by the news. Because, the news would never lie. It must be true if it's coming from the news. Oh, and if anybody else started to question it besides these 10 or 15 people, then you bring the New York City madam back, Ashley Bamfield, and she'll pop up and give you a report down there in the street about World Trade Center 7's upcoming collapse. I believed it back then, but I should have yelled into the TV. I should have asked Ashley to go back and work her brothel. Let me just go off script here and tell a personal story. This is about 18 years ago, but this is as clear as day to me. I was watching in San Francisco. We were back home in the apartment. My cousin and I, we shared the outrageous rent back in the dot-com era. And there was this tremendous buzz that this thing was going to collapse. And I remember I watched Ashley Bamfield. Didn't know at the time she was a New York City madam, but I watched her pop up and others. There were other news reports. There was this buzz. I remember my cousin even say, "Oh, that one's going to collapse." And we watched and we waited for it. Everybody knew. And the point is, looking back, ridiculous. There's just no way if this was, I want to say, a normal or natural collapse, which is impossible because no steel building has ever collapsed. I'll get to that in the next section. But there's just no way, if it did collapse from the extraordinary events of that day, nobody would have been able to predict basically when it was coming. 100% brought down exactly in the fashion and at exactly the time they wanted it to come down. Putting the comedy aside for a moment, this is the first time in history where a building not wired with explosives was predicted to collapse before it did. Actually, forget the prediction. It's the first building to collapse ever. Well, other than the 2 that collapsed a few hours before. I guess they were the first and second buildings to ever collapse from fire. So in 100 years, no steel buildings collapsed from fire. Then 3 do it on the same day. Then none have since. So that makes sense. We'll go back and say it like Lee Boy from Shallow Hal. Yeah, we'll blend. Now let me speak directly to the person screaming at their screen right now. Of course, I know what you're yelling about. That the steel buildings that collapsed from fire were actually struck by jumbo jets? Did I forget that little footnote? Well, genius, the peddlers of the official fairy tale in the government, NIST, said the cause of collapse was fire, not aircraft. No matter what they said, in the North Tower, Tower 1, 90 floors were unaffected. The plane hit up high. Not a paper clip was out of place in about those 90 floors. So how did they collapse in free fall speed? They were unaffected. Like if you go out back, stack up 10 bricks. Now quickly whip out the 9th. Remove the 9th. Do the 8 bricks below pancake down into dust at free fall speed? We just marvel how people can't see this. It's so absurd. Anyway, let's get back to this Roman comedy and Greek tragedy. Okay, where were we? Firefighters on the street are recorded via microphones, asking people to move back because World Trade Center 7 is going to blow up. We've all heard that. The retired prostitute, Ashley Banfield, now reports WTC 7 is about to go down at any moment. While everyone is pulling back from World Trade Center 7 because of a tiny fire, a daring reporter runs into the building to interview a Secret Service officer manning his post in the lobby. Other than shattered glass, we see there's no real damage to the structure of World Trade Center 7. The camera now pans to Madame Banfield on the street close to Ground Zero. She's interviewing a woman holding a newborn baby. With a few 100 billion pieces of fine particulate and asbestos floating in the air from the collapse of the North and South Tower, standing down at Ground Zero with your asthmatic infant seems normal to people watching on TV. A rumble is heard, and Ashley says, "This is it." Thinking selflessly for others, Madame Banfield instructs the woman to protect her baby, and the woman takes her good advice, covering the baby's head with a piece of cloth.
Advise us to leave because we have... Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way, please. Be careful of your baby.
At 5:35 p.m., the third steel skyscraper of the day collapses at free fall speed. The roof of building number 7 finds the ground in about 8.5 seconds, the same speed as throwing the dude's bowling ball out of a hovering E-Team helicopter. 200 feds and all of NIST comb the streets of New York once again, looking for Harley Guy and looking to ask Harley Guy to explain to them what happened to the building, for he would know. The marbles champion from Brooklyn watching on TV ponders how 2 airplanes could have taken down all 7 skyscrapers in the complex, and he contemplates if he can employ the same technique in a future tournament. The world wakes up on September 12, 2001, and hundreds of millions of people ask if something like that could have really happened. As they've been trained, they turn on the television before doing anything else. The 20 news channels that morning are giving America every detail on what happened the day before. There's nothing to figure out or interpret for yourself, for the TV knows all. Subtle hints are being planted that the mighty U.S. military will soon need to mobilize back into the land of camels. The non-news stations have returned to their regularly scheduled programming, like The Bold and the Beautiful, Oprah, and Glow, the gorgeous ladies of wrestling. Yes, the plastic men and women at the news stations lay out what happened the day before in precise detail. Of course it was Osama bin Laden. What else would it be? The FBI also has the names and even the photographs of each one of the terrorists on each team. How'd they get the pictures? They even know who flew the planes. 2 more days go by. Stranded passengers all over the United States are still finding their way home and paying exorbitant one-way rent-a-car fees with massive drop-off charges. Dan Rather interviews a FEMA coordinator who says his FEMA team arrived at Ground Zero the night before 9/11. Does Dan ask any follow-up questions about that? Of course not. Willie Rodriguez and about 10 others report massive explosions in the basement of the World Trade Centers before any plane ever hit. Barry Jennings reports hearing explosions inside WTC 7 and walking past dead bodies on his way out. He turned up dead months later, and 2 days before the official NIST report was released on what they say happened to WTC 7. The 5 people who recorded an image of United Flight 175 hitting the South Tower turned in their 8mm tapes to CNN, so the loop of the plane hitting can be played over and over and over all day long for 6 months straight. The 100,000 tourists in New York that day and the 20,000 or so people that live in Lower Manhattan who have video cameras in their apartments somehow recorded nothing. The 100 global news agencies who have branch offices in New York City employing hundreds of, quote, cameramen captured nothing. No global news agency thought to point a camera at the top of the WTC complex after the North Tower was struck? With at most only 5 videos shot inside of 10 blocks, I guess nobody did. What about all the advertising agencies that have state-of-the-art cameras in New York City? Nobody there took out one of their cameras? What about all the modeling agencies? They have cameras, I think. Where was BBC One and BBC Two? Where was Al Jazeera, Univision, Telemundo, and hundreds of other international news agencies around the world? They're all in New York. You've never heard of them. The top news outlet, for example, in Beijing is in New York. Tokyo, they're in New York. Rio de Janeiro, they're in New York. They're there. Trust me, you just don't watch the programming. They're all there. Where were their cameras? Why did CNN have to pay somebody for the footage? Why didn't they just point their 20 cameras towards the top of WTC-1 as a mile-long plume of smoke streamed from it? See, the thinking here is cameras at a distance pointed at the top of WTC-1 would see something hit WTC-2, okay, even if you weren't looking for it or searching for it. That's the point here. In a metropolis where about 1 million people could see the top of the towers on that crystal clear blue day, getting 4 or 5 somewhat decent videos of something hitting the South Tower seems impossible. In total, there are only about 15 videos in total of something hitting the South Tower. Now, how is that possible in New York City, where the top of those towers could be seen miles away on such a clear day? The people hanging all over the outside of Thunderdome are stirred up by seeing a looped video of a plane hitting the South Tower 150,000 times a week. They call for a quick military response against the goat herders. George Bush comes to New York City and stands upon the Ground Zero rubble pile and says that the people that knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. The wording of one of the most important speeches in all of history is never by accident or delivered extemporaneously, although that's the act put forth. Bush promised that the people who knocked the buildings down would hear all of us. That is all he promised. He didn't say anything about getting them or killing them or disemboweling them or anything. He said, they'll hear us. Little did that firefighter he was clutching onto know that right there, essentially, was the guy who did it. Instead of just asking for the help of CNN's Peter Arnett to find bin Laden because he was there in his Batcave interviewing him about a year before, the CIA and the DOD take the indirect approach, and they try to do it themselves. Nobody calls up Peter at CNN and says, "How'd you find bin Laden?" The Pentagon decides to support the Afghani Northern Alliance with special forces on horses, who defeat the Taliban in about 6 months. If history shows the U.S. defeated Mullah Omar's heroin army in about 6 months, one wonders why the U.S. is still there 20 years later. History tells us that there was an endless series of screw-ups, and the elusive bin Laden escaped the trillion-dollar DoD infrastructure by climbing over the Tora Bora Mountains, dragging his dialysis equipment behind him over the rocks with a team of donkeys. Well, history doesn't say he pulled the dialysis equipment over the rocks. I added that one. The U.S. drones and satellites, though, who were told in 1980 could read car license plates from space, are unable to locate the 6'5" Arab over 1,000 square miles with no trees. Since bin Laden can't be found, the United States tackles the terrorist scourge in other ways, by invading other countries that have nothing to do with it. The cooked-up weapons of mass destruction mantra is dusted off for a second time, and a few months later, Saddam Hussein is hanged on Al Jazeera TV. After spending $100 billion trying to protect a green zone in Baghdad, the U.S. withdraws from Iraq, just to come right back again with troops 6 months later. ISIS, though, is very pleased the U.S. left behind so many Toyota trucks during their temporary withdrawal. Finally, after years, there's a break in the search for bin Laden. The U.S. gets a tip. There's a 95% certainty that he's hiding in a compound in Pakistan, watching VHS videotapes of Baywatch. Knowing that bin Laden may move around to various compounds at a moment's notice, an emergency meeting of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs is called for the next morning. The decision is made to perform a daring raid to get bin Laden. With unprecedented urgency in case bin Laden relocates to another hideout in Pakistan, one with a better selection of VHS movies, the Special Forces construct an exact replica of the Pakistani compound, and they train in it for 5 whole months, while bin Laden waits patiently for them to be ready. On May 2nd, 2011, which in Gematria simply codes to 9/11, but that's just a coincidence, a night raid is ordered. Bin Laden is killed hiding under his bed, clutching CJ's image. Enraged their national borders have been violated, the Pakistani army races after the American Special Forces helicopters in old pickup trucks. An arrow bounces off the titanium hull of one of the American Chinooks before it disappears safely over the Afghan border. The United States immediately flies bin Laden's remains to the USS Carl Vinson out at sea and does what anyone would do. They dump the body over the side of the ship with no pictures and just one non-VIP witness, the seaman who happened to be swabbing the deck that morning. "Seaman Jones, come over here, sailor." Yes, sir? Yes, sir." "I want you to witness this, sailor. Rolled in these white sheets here is the body of Osama bin Laden. Now, do you see that, son?" No, sir. It looks like an old rug wrapped in a standard issue mattress liner, and a mattress liner that's been stained." "No, son, it's not an old rug. Under that cloth right there is Osama bin Laden. Now, do you see that? Oops, there he goes. We just dumped him in the water. Now, you witnessed that, son, didn't you? That was his Muslim burial at sea. That was us respecting Muslim cultures. Now, you're going to corroborate that story, aren't you, son? You tell all the press now you just saw Osama bin Laden dumped into the water." Yes, sir." Now, I'm not one for the archaic old practice of putting a head on a stake, but at least we would have been able to see that they really got him, and at least we would have been able to see, if the head was on a stake, that there was somebody that actually existed called Osama bin Laden. Amazingly, this is the story of 9/11 that is told, and more amazingly, believed by most people. Shortly after this story, the U.S. goes on to fight 4 more wars. First in Iraq, then in Libya, then in Syria. And the U.S. later fights a war against Bedouins in Yemen through its puppet proxy, Saudi Arabia, and stirs up an uprising in Egypt that leads to the Arab Spring. That would have made 6 wars, but we can't quite call that one a formal war. The few thousand dead came away from the battlefield. As of the time of this writing in 2019, the Corporation of the United States is pushing a